I had spent almost 3 years scraping remaining suburban bedroom walls' energy signatures and telling distraught homeowners that be familiar with their deceased aunt, I wasn't attempting to get in touch with the thermostat. The issue was simply faulty wiring. Paranormal investigation by the government, it appeared remarkable on paper. However, the truth was that there were several documents to fill out. Cases that were 99% mundane, and bosses who were suspicious with a 1% tolerance for true oddity. Thus I was summoned to Director Chen's office on a grey day, afternoon on Thursday, and pushed a manila file across her desk. I thought there would be more rats in the basement, that a retiree had persuaded themselves poltergeists were they. Basic assignment of inventory, she told me without looking at me. That ought to have been my initial red flag. Chen always maintained eye contact. The Museum of History and Curiosities, a tiny, private museum that is now undergoing renovations, we need someone to inventory the collection overnight. Check to see if anything has been moved or broken. I went through the file. The museum appeared to be just another dusty location. A repository of forgotten American culture, the only taxidermied creatures I'd ever encountered, the typical array of items. Historical dioramas nobody cared any more overnight. Why? 3 weeks ago, the prior watchman vanished. Martin Hayes no indication of a break-in, no conflict, no evidence on the surveillance cameras. She merely tapped a photo attached to the file before disappearing. A middle-aged guy with weary eyes gazed back at me. A voluntary disappearance was determined to be the cause by local law enforcement. However, protocol demands that we remove the area before the owner may. Reopen, and what do you expect I'll discover? Ghosts that devour security guards. Chen's face was still impassive. I have faith that you will carry out your responsibilities, file a report, and get compensated for your overtime work. You're out there this evening. The curator will see you at 6. I ought to have asked more questions. I should have questioned why they were sending me by myself. To a location where someone had disappeared, however, the overtime pay was fair. And to be honest, a peaceful evening by oneself in a museum was preferable to spending another night in my flat seeing the walls get closer. I accepted the job of the Hall of History and Oddities, located on the outskirts of the city, a low brick structure which must have been amazing in the 1950, but now it seemed to be gradually reclaiming itself by its overgrown surroundings at 5:47 p.m. I showed up, right as the autumn sun began to set behind the bare trees that encircled the site. There were no cars in the parking lot, with the exception of an old sedan that appeared to be older than half the displays inside. I took my gear from the trunk. Electronic magnetic field reader, thermal imaging flashlight, the typical set of tools which often turned out to be pricey for what was essentially a building inspection. Kudos, the air had an odd calm, which occurs just before nightfall when the world appears to be taking a break and holding its breath. I have always detested that hour of the day. I was unable to knock since the front door opened first, and I was directly in front of the most terrified individual. The oldest person I've ever seen. Albright seemed to have been put together. From additional parts of other, the elderly become frail and thin, whose liver, botted hands were always shaking and eyes that moved about like caged birds. He was wearing a threadbare cardigan. Notwithstanding the moderate weather, and as he extended his hand to shake mine, his palm felt chilly and sweaty. Mr. Carver, his voice was a dry whisper. The researcher Alex is all right. I walked in, immediately overcome by that unique museum odor, old chemicals for preserving wood and dust that had been left alone for centuries. I appreciate you staying late to let me in. If I had a choice, I would not have remained at all, he mumbled as he shut the door after us. With apparent reluctance, the vacant entryway reverberated with the sound of the key clicking. I no longer remain beyond dusk. Not since Martin. He stopped wringing his hands, and then he trailed off. Prior to this I had seen it. who would persuade themselves that something is supernatural, had transpired when the reality was often far more mundane. Martin Hayes had likely just quit his position. Perhaps suffered a breakdown, perhaps he stole something and then ran away. I stated that it occurred around Martin. Retrieving my notepad, "When did you last see him?" The mention of the term made Albright flinch. "Tuesday night, 3 weeks ago, as usual. I gave him the keys at 6 in the afternoon." The regulations were on the table. Just as ever, he pulled out a little something after fiddling about in his cardigan pocket. The sort of notebook that you would get at a gas station. I thought he could drop it because his hands were trembling so much. He had left by Wednesday morning. No sign. Nothing, simply vanished, and the phone was off the hook. I didn't mention the strange specifics of the call. Martin's regulations, he jotted them down after his first week, asserted their importance, stated that they had everything under control, thrust the notepad at me as if his fingers were being burnt. "You must adhere to them without fail." The notebook was mine without exception. Feeling the weight of his desperate stare, the cover had frayed, worn borders, and there were 6 entries when I opened it, written in a trembling hand which became more and more unpredictable as they continued down the page. Some of the words had smeared ink. As if the author's palm was perspiring. Rule number 1. In the event that the old town square diorama makes whistling sounds, keep your breath. Until it goes away, it keeps track of your breath. I raised an eyebrow, it's true. With a voice break, Albright cut him off. Martin also agreed that they were worthless. But only after the 3rd night he knew that they all understand. He ultimately snatched my arm with unexpected power. As his fingertips tore through my jacket, "Please, whatever you do, adhere to the regulations precisely as they are stated. Don't attempt to outsmart them or put them to the test. Simply follow them." I slowly removed my arm from his hold. Resisting the impulse to roll my eyes, this was precisely the sort of superstitious paranoia. I dealt with it all the time. "I am grateful for your concern, Mr. Albright. However, I have received formal training as an investigator. I have experienced real paranormal occurrences. I am aware of my behavior." The same thing was said by Martin. Albright's tone became a whisper. He was also a skeptic. Ex-military policeman who fear nothing, and now he's left, and the Civil War exhibit features a brand, New Mannequin, which was not there before my neck's hair prickled. However, I suppressed it. It had to be a coincidence. I'll bear the rules in mind. None. The whole group moved closer, smiling, and I could detect both fear and coffee on his breath. "You will adhere to their instructions to the letter. Assure me that the anguish in his eyes was real." I'd give him that. Furthermore, arguing with him would be a waste of time. He undoubtedly slumped with relief. The terror, though, was always evident on his face. I haven't changed anything from when Martin left. His logbook is kept in the security room. The eastern wing of the 2nd story, the lights are on timers, and the keys are on the desk. At 7 p.m., the majority of the structure becomes dark. In order to conserve energy, the main hall and the emergency exits are the only places that remain illuminated. He went back to the entrance. I fumbled for the handle and closed the door behind me. Never let anyone open it after hours. The museum doesn't technically have any visitors. What if there's a crisis? After that, you phone 911 and you wait at the security desk while the door is locked until they get here. He yanked the door open, and the floor was covered with the setting sun's light. Like blood. And Mr. Carver, before I could ask him what he meant, "Don't pick up the phone." He was almost running towards his car when he left. I peered through the window as he sped out of the parking lot with the desperation of someone trying to escape a crime scene. The tail lights vanished into the approaching dusk. I locked the door, and I was all by myself, and turned to inspect my realm for the evening. The main hall had a sad beauty. High ceilings, marble floors that have been worn smooth by decades of footsteps, intricate woodwork, which conjured up a time when craftsmanship was valued. The 2nd story was reached by a magnificent stairway, and several exhibition rooms may be reached through doors. In the middle of the space, there was a huge grandfather clock standing there, its glass face reflecting the lights overhead at 3:07. The hands were frozen. At 6:23 p.m., I looked at my wristwatch. There was lots of time before the light began to fade. I took another look at the notebook. Rule 2. Going through the other rules, the statue of the state should be facing the wall by sunset. If you discover that it is turned around, don't look it in the eyes, close your own eyes, and turn it back. The third rule is that the mannequins will move around. This is typical unless, however, one is holding a contemporary object. If the item is no longer yours, leave it alone. Rule 4. Don't pay attention to the whales singing. Taking recordings for over 30 seconds at a stretch, it does not merely imitate whales. Rule 5. The main hall's clock is broken and displays time as early hour of 3:07:00 a.m. If you ever hear a chime, report to the security office right away. Don't come out. Lock the door. Unless you hear the sound of a single crow, the 3 times rule is number 6. Never should you ever respond to the museum's landline at 3:07:00 a.m. It will ring once. I chuckled and shut the notebook. The reverberating sound in the empty room, someone said this was ridiculous. Maybe Martin himself planned a complex hoax, perhaps to rationalize leaving the position. Perhaps merely to irritate whoever took over after him. The rules resemble poor, frightening poster, the sort of stuff that young people shared on forums to continue frightening one another. I was a pro. I'd indulge my fears and do a thorough job. I put my equipment bag down and looked at the fundamental layout. The file contained what Chen had added: second story of the Egyptian display, west wing diorama of the Civil War South Corridor, first floor diorama of Old Town Square Northern Corridor on the first floor, basement level of the Ocean exhibit. I looked at my watch once more as the sun set quickly. The notepad said 6:31 p.m. The rascal was forced to face the wall. I might choose to disregard it by sundown and demonstrate that the regulations were absurd, or follow it and stay away from any "I told you so" moments. If Albright properly examined security footage, I would comply. The Egyptian display was less extensive than I had anticipated. Merely one room covered in glass cases holding pottery fragments, pieces of hieroglyphic tablets, and jewelry bastet was represented in the center of the room by a stone sculpture. The roughly 2-foot tall cat deity, and placed on a marble stand in the middle of the space. It was in front of the entrance as I got closer. Its sculpted eyes appeared to be tracking me. The workmanship was outstanding. Each whisker was carved into the stone, which you could see. Every claw, meticulously created a kind of dark stone, was implanted in the eyes, which reflected light in a way that was disturbing. It was both exquisite and frightening in equal measure. I walked behind it. It was heavier than I thought when I picked it up by the bottom and flipped it around to face the wall. As soon as I let it go, I felt foolish. I worked for the government as an investigator, receiving orders from a notepad written by a missing security officer, all in an effort to calm down a frightened elderly gentleman. However, I had complied by Rule 2. I went on with my initial walkthrough, taking notes and pictures with my phone camera, as expected. The Civil War display was dusty, lifelike representations of Union and Confederate soldiers striking, frozen stances, swords and muskets behind glass war, knout flags hanging from the roof. I counted a total of 5 mannequins, everyone in their right place based on the little signs below them. Nobody had anything modern. The North Corridor housed the Old Town Square diorama, a huge exhibition recreating a street scene from the 1890s. Little structures with illuminated windows, carriages pulled by horses, tiny individuals going about their everyday routines. It was the kind of thing I would have adored as a child. Before I discovered that magic was often just smart engineering and a forced perspective, a little sign stated that the original creator was formerly a master clockmaker, and I could see little gears, two seen through a few of the windows waiting for the scene to be animated. I didn't hear any whistling. When I arrived at the security office, the sun had completely set by 6:54 p.m. Nothing was visible from the window save for darkness. Leaning against the glass, the office was precisely as I had anticipated. A chair and a desk, a series of monitors displaying a grainy picture, white and black feeds from several cameras located around the facility, and an old one-rotary phone that appeared to be at home in a museum by itself next to the telephone, was Martin's journal. A notebook bigger than the laws. I opened it and discovered complete records for each evening he had worked. Beginning 3 months ago, the initial entries were professional. Observing temperature changes, sounds that are strange, which ultimately proved to be the building settling somehow. A bath had made its way into the main hall. However, about 2 weeks later, night 14 saw a shift in the tone. Old Town Square's whistling could be heard. As directed, I held my breath at 11:47 p.m. It came to a halt just outside the office entrance. Was able to hear breathing from the other side. Lasted for about 2 minutes prior to the retreat of footsteps. Adhering to the guidelines pays off. Should continue to adhere to the guidelines. The basket had turned around at 9:15 p.m. on night 21. Turned it back while keeping my eyes shut, even though I was aware that someone was staring at me. The atmosphere of the Egyptian exhibition was 15 degrees cooler than the remainder of the structure. The statue's electromagnetic field reading reached a high of 7.2 milligauss. The 28th night, one of the Civil War soldiers is out of place. The private in the Union who ought to be loading his rifle is now standing at attention. The cameras provide no evidence of motion, and there is no explanation. However, it's certainly not in the same place as it was yesterday. The submissions became increasingly desperate. More paranoid the night of Martin's disappearance. The last entry was made. I'm not able to continue with this on night 89. The regulations are insufficient, despite the fact that they protect us. They are being put through something. The phone rang at 2:00 a.m., putting me to the test this evening. I didn't respond until 20 minutes before. The clock rang once more at precisely 3:07:00 a.m. I didn't respond either. However, I heard my own voice at the other end. It knows where I reside because I'm whispering coordinates. I believe it is aware of my family's location. Follow the regulations if you're reading this. Avoid making the same errors I did, and whatever you do, don't. The statement concluded halfway through. The pen trailed behind, forming a ragged line. I shut the logbook, combating the anxiety that was spreading up my spine. Martin wanted this precisely, to give whoever came after him the impression that, terrified and paranoid, that it was psychological manipulation. Nothing further. The building's lights went out in patches. Precisely at 7 p.m. As Albright had stated, the screens shone in the dark, and I was able to view the displays presented in grayscale and black. The main hall continued to be lit, like the signs for the emergency exit, rendering the entire scene in an unhealthy green. White light. I sat down in the chair and started working. The list of inventory that Chen had given me, and began comparing items. The job was mind, numbingly dull, which was precisely what I required. Boring was normal and enjoyable. I heard the whistling around 9:47 p.m. It began softly and at a distance. A happy song that I couldn't identify exactly, something old-fashioned, the sort of tune you would hear from a music box. It was approaching from the direction of the northern corridor, where the old town square diorama was in the dark. I instinctively grabbed the notebook with my hand. Regular 1, when the old town square diorama starts to whistle "Don't breathe" until it stops. I nearly didn't do it. I had the urge to walk down there, using my flashlight, and show that it was only old pipes or pass through a window gap or any of the 100 ordinary sounds in old buildings, but another part of me, the part that had looked into a large number of real paranormal events, to have a greater understanding than to be completely dismissive. Keep in mind the desperation in Bright's eyes, and the fear evident in Martin's last log entries. The whistling persisted even when I held my breath, increasing in volume gradually rather than getting closer, as if the source of the noise was simply louder, was steadily growing in volume. The melody was so happy. Thus, at odds in the face of the growing anxiety that was consuming me, I began to experience a burning sensation in my lungs. How long was I able to hold my breath? A minute. Secondly, the whistling intensified, and now I could hear something beneath it, a rhythmic noise, as though someone were walking through the hallways going in the direction of the security office. My eyesight began to fail at the borders. When my body was begging for oxygen, I, however, maintained a firm grip on my lips. With teeth clenched now, the whistling was directly outside the door. It was so loud that it should have hurt the security office door's handle was visible to me. Waiting for it to change direction, awaiting whatever was outside to enter, and then it suddenly ceased. Simply quit in the middle of a song, not a fade. The silence that came after was more unbearable than the noise. On the other side of the door, I could sense a presence, was able to feel that there was someone there, standing and waiting. I let out a slow, vibrating exhale, and the air immediately entered my mouth. I overheard it. A long, contented sigh coming from the other side of the door, such as whatever it was that was out there had gotten the response it was seeking, followed by the sound of feet walking away. Not the sound of shoes on marble, however. There was something else that clicked and scraped. I was speechless in the seat, my heart pounding in my chest, gazing at the door. The security screens revealed nothing. The exhibits were quiet and motionless, and the hallways were deserted. But I'd sensed it. I'd heard it. There might be real regulations. The moments following the end of the whistling moved ahead at a painfully slow pace. I stayed in the security office chair, hardly able to breathe, keeping an eye out for any movement on the screens. The streams displayed nothing, with the exception of silent displays and empty corridors, however. I was unable to get rid of the assurance that something had been outside my door. I could hear my exhale with what seemed like delight. The museum had undergone a transformation. The air itself now seemed heavier and different. Charged with a wicked consciousness, I had a strong feeling, even though I couldn't put it into words. My watch said 10:13 p.m., 5 hours before 3:07 a.m. It would be 5 hours before that phone rang. The temperature had noticeably decreased. In front of my face, my breath wasn't very misty, but close. I rubbed my arms through my coat and glanced at the little thermostat on the wall, 62 degrees. When I first walked into the workplace, it was at least 70 degrees. The building's heating system must have turned off with the lights, I reasoned to myself. Old buildings lost heat rapidly. There was a logical explanation. However, logical explanations became more and more hollow. I made myself remain here, unable to move. Couldn't finish the inventory, and in spite of everything I was still officially on assignment. Chen, the director, would expect a report. The notion of attempting to make sense of tonight's events in an official document held breath to prevent being noticed by whistling being, according to regulations left by missing predecessor hours ago. It would have been ridiculous. It now appeared unattainable. I had to stay busy and continue to move forward. Being in this room was preferable to sitting still, hearing the sound of my heartbeat and expecting the next impossibility to occur. I picked up my torch and returned to the dimly lit museum. The emergency its signs illuminate everything with that nauseating color. A green radiance making well-known forms appear odd and menacing. The corridors' margins shadows appear to be both deeper and twice as deep as they were previously. I believed I detected motion out of the corner of my eye. Something hiding behind a display case, something moving back around the corner. But when I pointed my flashlight at it, the Civil War exhibit was on my path, so there was nothing I could do. I have previously documented it, but the protocol necessitated reviewing every section. Repeatedly during the night, I convinced myself that I was adhering to protocol. That was something I did not recognize. I was looking to see if there had been any updates, if the regulations' cautions regarding mannequins changing positions were as authentic as the whistling had been. The light from my flashlight passed over the 5 mannequins in their striking postures, a Confederate soldier pointing his rifle, Union soldier, priming his weapon, Confederate officer, directing an unseen faux Union Army man, lying injured private Union, standing at attention. I counted them again, 5 my light, then noticed something wrong, just like before. The Union, which stood at attention, was kept secret, held something in his left hand, anything little and dark, that was absolutely not included in the original exhibition. I took a step closer, my chest constricting. I was taken aback by the realization. My writing instrument, the ballpoint issued by the government, I've been taking notes with it. On the inventory list when I entered here, I had it in my jacket pocket. I was sure of that before. The mannequin's stiff fingers now held it tightly. The clip caught over its painted thumb. The sound was so strangled that I nearly burst out laughing. Possibly bordered by hysteria, I was being played too much by someone. Perhaps Albright, or by an employee who has access to the security footage. Shuffling things around in order to frighten the government inspector, it was a sophisticated practical joke. Rule 3 had to be whispered in my ear. When one is holding a contemporary item, leave the item, since it is no longer yours. I said screw that out loud. In the vacant exhibit hall, my voice was excessively loud, but I didn't give a damn. I had enough of participating in this foolishness. I would turn the statue to make the whistling laugh. However, I wasn't going to let a pen slip through my fingers. To a certain superstitious practice, I made contact and took the pen out of the mannequin's grasp. The painted fingers felt a bit harsh and chilly. Bad plaster finish texture, nothing happened. Nothing moved. Only a pen in a mannequin's hand back in my own place. Now I said to the empty space, see. Nothing as soon as the word came out of my mouth. I wished I hadn't said it. The temperature decreased more. Immediately, not slowly as if I had entered a refrigerator, my breath did fog at this point. In the beam of my flashlight there were dense white clouds, and the sensation of being watched, which was a minor discomfort. Since the whistling event transformed into something undeniable, with a sudden increase in intensity, eyes on my neck, and back the weight of the focus from anything that did not want me well, I made a deliberate turn. The Union private mannequin remained in the same spot. However, there was something amiss. The painted face seemed different in some way. The utterance appeared to be less empty, more concentrated, and its left hand, the one I was holding my pen with, had his fingers somewhat bent, and was currently open like they just released something. Or as though they were approaching, I retreated as my flashlight beam trembled. Unable to take my eyes off the dummy, and he moved the light across the other people. The Union fighter, the individual who had been filling his rifle, was still present. However, that was incorrect. His rifle was lying on the floor at his feet. The wooden stock on the ground barrel pointing in no direction, I said. Rule number 3. The model's posture will shift. This is typical, but it didn't feel that way. This gave the impression of being a response. As a result, I withdrew from the display, the beam of my flashlight moving erratically across the mannequin's right. Before I arrived at the hallway, I saw it. A flash of motion so fast that I nearly didn't see it. The Union private's head had only moved slightly. Only enough for the painted eyes to follow me. I didn't sprint as I fled. I maintained a professional pace as I walked. I told myself with intention. My hands trembled and my heart pounded nonetheless. And I was absolutely certain that I knew that I committed a grave error in the security room again. I closed the door and examined the screens with shaky hands. All 5 mannequins were displayed in the Civil War exhibit. Immobile in their places when moving, the Union man remained motionless, precisely where he had been before, but now his hand was empty, and the way he loads his rifle, the buddy's gun, was on the ground. I watched the live for 10 seconds. I watched for 18 minutes without seeing anything move. At the periphery of the camera's field of vision, a person strolled by. Only a hazy Union blue that vanished there, and then passing through a tunnel that should have been empty for the following 20 minutes. My tongue was parched. I saw glimpses on other monitors. A glimpse of a blue uniform hiding behind a display case in the segment on natural history. A person standing at the very end of a hallway, too far away and dark to see clearly prior to it, moving sideways and disappearing. The motions were excessively gentle as well. The models weren't that fluid in their movements. Not everyone moved in that manner. It was searching for me, pursuing me, and it was my fault for getting the pen back. At 11:47 p.m. I made myself do another round. I was required to inspect the Egyptian display. Rule 2 Bast. It was required to be facing the wall by sundown, according to the agreement. But what if it then switched direction? What if not checking were worse than checking? The second floor west wing seemed to be miles away. Each shadow posed a danger. The possibility of an ambush at every turn. With my flashlight in one hand, I went up the stairs. With my phone in the other, the emergency call screen is ready to go. Even if I had no clue what to say to 911, hello, a mannequin is chasing me because I violated one of the rules. In a museum rumored to be haunted, the entrance to the Egyptian display was ajar. I had a clear recollection of shutting it earlier. The exhibits were meant to stay closed. In order to maintain the temperature and humidity, an additional fact from Martin's logbook, I gently opened the door. The hinges made a sound from a horror film. I would have rolled my eyes at that this afternoon. It only made my pulse beat faster now. The rascal had turned around. The statue no longer faced the wall. It was in the middle of the space, standing on its pedestal. And it was in front of the door. Rule 2 was clear when I faced it. In the event that it's flipped over, don't stare at its eyes, turn it back, and close your own eyes. I quickly closed my eyes. However, I had already seen and looked at it. For that split second before, my intuition outstripped my intellect, and during that little bit of time what I saw was beyond explanation. The eyes were open rather than carved open. The empty sockets, not the teeth including stones I had seen before, in fact, open with the covers pulled back, and they were no longer stone, they were damp and organic. They had been staring right at me and were still alive. I remained still in the doorway, with his eyes tightly closed that my sight was filled with colorful patches. I moved forward with my hands shaking uncontrollably, extending his arms in an attempt to recall the arrangement of the space. The pedestal is 4 or 5 steps away. I let out a gasp when my shin hit the marble base. I made contact and located the statue's smooth stone form. The stone was warm when I traced it back to its head. Indeed, warm rather than at room temperature, as if something living had been pushed against it. I snatched it and forcefully twisted it towards the wall. In my terror, I almost tipped it over. When I sensed that it was facing the other way, I let go of it and fell back, with my eyes yet closed until my back struck the wall close to the door. I just opened my eyes then. The sculpture was turned toward the wall. Everything seemed to be in order. However, I sensed that I was not alone in the space. A presence, a weight, an ancient and tolerant intellect, and completely conscious of me. I didn't make it look like a brisk walk this time when I went for a run. Professional stroll, I sprinted through the hallways and down the steps, and returning to the security room where I slammed and locked the door at midnight, the clock on the wall read 12:00 a.m., and my hands were trembling. My breath came in raspy gasps as I fell into the seat. I dropped the pen on the table where it landed, and I gazed at it with what appeared to be hatred. I had paid a price for that pen. The transgression that caused me to change was taking it back. From spectator to participant, from victim to victim, the exhibits were viewed on the monitors. There were 4 mannequins on display in the Civil War area. He was no longer in his Union private position. The ocean exhibits the screensaver displayed a flickering whale song show. The old town square model remained in the dark, with its little structures and frozen waiting statues, and in the Egyptian display visible on the grainy, monochrome feed as I left it, the jerk statue was facing the wall. However, every few minutes I was certain that I could detect the slightest motion, as if its head was moving very slightly, progressively turning back around. I was no longer an investigator, as the chase had started. I was praying, a museum that had come to life, and discovered that I was lacking, and I had more than 2 hours before 3:07:00 a.m. If things would get any worse, I will read the guidelines after grabbing Martin's notebook. Every word, which is now laden with significance that I had overlooked in the past, these were not ideas. They weren't superstitions. These were instructions for surviving, and I had already broken one. The question now was if I would live long enough to shatter another one. The security office was transformed into a cage. Between 1 and 2 in the morning, I've been gazing at the screens for too long. That the feeds are in black and white had burnt themselves into my sight, illusory images that remained when I blinked the wall clock. Not the hall's grand father clock, the regular digital one, though, is on top of the table. Moved ahead with excruciating slowness 1:00 a.m. The phone wouldn't ring for an hour and 20 minutes. In the past hour, the museum had become less noisy. However, it was the incorrect sort of quiet. Expecting, but not calm, as if the structure was holding its breath, anticipating something will occur, the monitors were completely still. 4 dummies were displayed in the Civil War exhibit. The Union private stayed away from his post. Somewhere beyond the camera feeds, I'm still hunting. Bastet was shown in the Egyptian display facing the wall. Despite my oath, the angle of her head had changed a little. I could barely make it out in the previous 10 minutes. Barely discernible from afar, via the closed office door, a noise resembling singing No whale song, singing, I remembered Rule 4 with perfect clarity. Don't pay attention to the whale song. Making recordings lasting longer than 30 seconds each, it's not just replicating whales. The basement housed the ocean show. The whale song show was displayed on a screensaver. At the time that I turned the monitors off, however, at this point I was able to hear the profoundness of it. Sad cries reverberating via the ventilation system of the structure. With the exception of the sound effects, I could hear something else under the whale calls. Words that were nearly syllables, but that I could hardly hear, however. My skin recoiled in identification. I counted seconds 10 while looking at my watch. 2015, the noises kept getting clearer. The whale song was distorted, warping into something that sounded unsettlingly, as if people were murmuring together 30 seconds and 25. It had to be turned off. The recording broke Rule 4 through constant play, and I was breaking it by listening. However, this implied leaving the security office. That required descending to the basement. By myself with the creatures that were following the museum, the whale song's soft voices, they gave something a name as they became more different. What I'm called Alex, come down, go down into the deep. I held the desk's edge tightly in my hands. Hard enough to turn my knuckles white, it was clear that this was a trap. I was told by the museum to leave this room. At risk, exposed, I ought to lock the door and remain here. We waited until morning, but the whale song persisted, and the regulations stated that don't pay attention for more than 30 seconds. I had previously exceeded that boundary. What else would happen if I continued to listen? What would occur if I broke any other rule? I made my choice at 2 in the morning. I picked up my flashlight, made sure my phone was in my pocket, and unlocked the door to the security office. The corridor outside was darker than I had remembered. The emergency eggs, its signs appearing less bright, their green radiance barely penetrated the darkness. The whale song was louder outside. Reverberating throughout the walls, the voices underneath it were now clearer. And with growing horror, I realized that my name wasn't the only one they were using. They were counting 7, 8, 9, 10, keeping track of my breath, just as the whistling had done. I tried to take deep breaths. As I walked silently towards the basement stairs, the museum had a distinct vibe from a few hours earlier. The corridors appeared to be longer. The doorways are narrower. The periphery of my vision was where the shadows shifted, and I thought I saw the Union soldier twice. At the other end of a hallway, observing me, before disappearing into the shadows once again, the basement staircase descended into total darkness. The light from my flashlight appeared fainter here. Only a few feet before being engulfed by the night, the whale song was now deafening. The voices beneath it calling out numbers with growing urgency, 23, 24, 25. The ocean display took up a big space at the base of the stairs. Its walls are painted to look like the deep sea. Commonly illuminated by gentle blue lights, it was now dark, with the exception of one monitor screen, which had a sick phosphorescent radiance. The whale song came from speakers. Positioned on the screen and in the ceiling, I was able to identify the origin. A movie showing whales swimming in deep water, however. The whales were mistaken. Their bodies were too long, their movements too sinuous, and when they faced the camera, I lunged for the control panel because their eyes were human, and shoved the power switch mid. Note, the whale song was interrupted by the screen going dark. The silence that ensued was complete. After that, I heard the whistling. It began softly and at a distance. The same happy song that was playing hours before, but this time it was originating from several places. The first floor featured the old town square diorama. However, the whistling could be heard coming from all directions by my side. Above me it was searching behind me, and it was nearby. I reflexively held my breath. My lungs having run down here, he was already on fire from the effort. The whistling became louder. I started to circle, and then I realized with a growing sense of terror that anything that made that sound no longer restricted to the diorama. It had been put out, or I would have disobeyed the rules and released it. It was freely roaming the museum. I started to see things now. How long had I been holding my breath? 30 seconds per minute. The ocean exhibit was right outside the whistling. Just now beyond the door, and I could hear something else underneath it, a moist, raspy sound resembling breathing via lungs filled with water. I was at the limit of my breath, holding capacity. I blew a breath as softly as I could, and the whistling abruptly ceased after that. It began again far closer. In the same room as me, right next to me, the light from my flashlight bounced about. As I ran toward the stairs, the whistling following me with a frightening zeal, I ascended the stairs 3 at a time. My heart was pounding so hard that I feared it might explode. Back of me, the footsteps were not quite audible to me. The scraping and clicking, a sound that indicates that something shouldn't be able to walk. I barged into the hallway of the first floor, and instantly realized that something was amiss. I didn't originate from this corridor. The corridor was longer, and the arrangement was different. Stretching into the unattainable distance, the museum was shifting and rearranging itself, making it more difficult to flee than I had heard loud, clear, and utterly impossible. The grandfather clock starting to chime, the initial hit, was loud and metallic. Just as erroneous as the guideline had predicted, the sound was like a machine self-destructing, like teeth grinding against each other. The sound resonated throughout my body and caused me to have a toothache at 3. 307. In the morning rule 5. If you ever hear a chime go to the security office, immediately shut the door, and doesn't come out until you hear a lone crow call. I approached the main hall 3 times. Where the stairway leading to the security office was located, the clock rang once more, and the noise appeared to reverberate throughout the cosmos. As I walked past the doors lining the hallway, they slammed shut. The grandfather clock chimed for the 3rd time, and I heard a lot of footsteps coming closer to where I am the whistle thing's clattering scrape, the Union soldiers' measured march, and something else again, which had the fluid grace of a hunting cat. I had to deal with doors that ought to have been in the hallway. Corners that didn't exist didn't magically appear. The gallery it was plotting on its own to prevent me from getting to safety. The clock sounded for the 7th time. When I at last arrived to the main hall, I could see the huge grandfather clock now, despite its hands being frozen at 3:07. Its inner workings, that dreadful chiming sound, the glass face had cracks. I could also see movement inside through the openings. Something writhing and dark. I ran up the stairs. I kept going until I got to the security office. I banged the door shut behind me and spun the key with trembling fingers as soon as I heard them come, a number of organizations congregating outside in the hall, the measured tread, the snapping scratch, the gentle cushioning of something moving on stone paws. They waited without attempting the door. I gasped and fell into the seat. The phone was then in my line of sight. The antiquated rotary phone that was on the desk, its receiver calmly sitting in its cradle. The clock on the wall showed that it was exactly 307:00 in the morning. The phone only rang once, with a piercing tone, which sounded incredibly loud in the confined space after that. I was thinking about silence, Rule 6. Never, when should you ever answer the museum's landline? At 307:00 a.m. it will ring once. I gave the phone a blank stare. I couldn't help but extend my hand in its direction. After that, the beings outside the door were pulled back, had become absolutely silent. The whole museum held its breath. This was the test. This was the last law. If I could just refrain from responding, if I could just stay away from this one thing, perhaps I could make it till dawn. Perhaps I could get out of this place. But the quiet that followed that one ring was the worst noise I had heard all night. I was by myself in the quiet, totally and utterly alone in a home, devoted to hunting the things that wanted me dead, or even worse. The silence was heavy and suffocating. And I understood since Albright left, I hadn't heard anyone else speak. There was no assistance available a few hours ago. Until morning, nobody would be looking after me. I was stranded here with items that I couldn't figure out. Following regulations that I had previously violated additionally, the phone was there. What if everything was bright? What if he had remembered something vital? A vital piece of information about the rules that may help me. What if my bosses had at last realized something was amiss and were attempting to contact me at precisely 3:07 p.m. The phone rang, exactly as the rules stated it would, however. Perhaps the violation wasn't in responding to it. It was not replied to. I reached for the receiver once more, my mind's rational side yelling at me to stop reminiscing me of all the regulations I had previously disobeyed, and all of the effects I had experienced, but the passionate side, the desperate and isolated, frightening section. I needed to hear a human voice. Required contact and support. The outside world kept waiting in silence. I grabbed the handset. The recipient was chilly to my ear, too heavy for what it should have been, as though the magnitude of my error had physical mass. There was nothing for a moment. Nothing but the empty stillness of a dead line, the sort of emptiness that gave the impression that it could eat the whole globe. I nearly persuaded myself that nothing would occur, that this last offense would be the one that didn't matter after that. I could hear breathing, but it wasn't human breathing. Not the rhythmic inhale and exhale of lungs and diaphragm. This was an older thing, anything that resembled the wind via old passageways, like the sigh of graves being unlocked after centuries of silence. Every hair on my body was raised by the noise, and causing ice to rush through my veins. Hello, I could hardly speak. I despised my helpless tone, even though I was in need of help and broken. The extent to which my arrogance had been stripped away throughout this never-ending night, the professional investigator had left. The only thing left was the frightened creature. It spoke after the breathing ceased. The voice was old and dry, exactly as I should have anticipated, as if pages were turning to dust on stone, as if it were a whisper of anything which had lost sight of what it meant to be alive, but had not forgotten a single thing about being dead. It just existed. It didn't rasp or growl, a sound that felt fundamentally wrong, which made my mind want to reject it completely. It didn't inquire about the identity of the person, or if this was the case. The questions would have been about people, questions that recognized me as a human being rather, with agency and decision. Making power, it inquired as to your location. It inquired, where are you? I made an effort to keep quiet. All the instincts I had left were shouting at me. Not to hang up the phone in response if I had, to toss it across the space. My jaw tightened, and my teeth grated against one another. I wouldn't give it what it wanted. I wouldn't respond. After everything, following all the breaches, maybe I could still fight against this one thing. But I found myself opening my mouth regardless. I'm located in the security office. The words escaped my lips, but not against my will, which was ripped from my mouth by something that had attached itself to me. As soon as I grabbed the receiver, I felt violated when I heard myself speak. The injury to my own vocal cords being run by another entity. Maybe I had given up my body, or maybe it had let me down. The instant I broke that last rule, the line went silent with a gentle last click. The ensuing silence was both complete and oppressive. I remained motionless in the chair, with the receiver still pressed against my ear, listening to zip. The beings outside the door were utterly silent. No clicking scrapes and no calculated footsteps, no gently cushioned stone feet. The whole museum appeared to be breathless, waiting for the conclusion of any sinister. By answering that call, I finished the ritual. I then listened to it for the first time, turning a key in the lock, but I was inside the office with the key. I could see it lying on the desk where I had placed it hours before. But the noise was undeniable, the metallic click and scrape of a key giving the lock to the security office. From the exterior, detaching the device, I had thrown only a few minutes before, when I had run away from the ringing clock. The second sound came right after. The door opening with a creak, I saw it take place. My body remained motionless in the chair. The receiver gradually sliding out of my lifeless grip, the door slid easily on its hinges, exposing the dim corridor behind it, the emergency exit. It shines unhealthy green light, however. The light appeared to halt at the doorway. Unable or disinterested in entering the security office, the third sound occurred when the door completed its full swing. Numerous synchronized footsteps entering the room intentionally make impossible. 3 people walked over the threshold. I discovered the fortitude to act at last, to reduce the telephone receiver back into its nest with such a strong shake in my hand that I almost missed. And then I glanced up at what had arrived for me. I invited in my arrogance and my dread, and my urgent desire for interpersonal interaction. The Union soldier was the first to enter. It was the private exhibit of the Civil War. The person whose hand had grasped my pen, the one I had stolen out of arrogance. But it wasn't a mannequin any more. If it had ever really been nothing more than a mannequin, it moved with graceful, fluid purpose. Each step exactly, and calculated. The face that had been painted was different. Now the features were more defined, More realistic, the flat, expressionless eyes from the exhibition were dark and insightful. Now packed with an entirely foreign intelligence, it carried a key in its left hand. A rusty iron key that I had never seen before, but in some way it was new. The one who had merely opened the door. From outside behind the soldier, Bastet entered. The sculpture had fallen off its pedestal, had come down from the Egyptian exhibit on the second floor, had strolled through the museum on stone feet, which inexplicably remained silent in spite of their mass. She wasn't turned toward the wall like I'd left her any more. She was no longer a statue whatsoever, not exactly the sculpted stone of her physique. Had acquired a dreadful fluidity, moving as though it were a muscle beneath skin, like something organic caught in a mineral state. Those eyes of hers that I had seen, opened those eyes which had stared at me with such a jolted desire, glowed brightly in the dark. She looked at me with the patient curiosity of a cat who had at last brought his prey into submission, and was determining the best way to have fun with it. Prior to the murder, the third figure was the worst. The old town square's whistling object upon entering the dioramas. I instantly understood. The reason it was limited to that display, the reason the regulations were so detailed regarding holding your breath. It was a man, shaped void in front of it, a haze of darkness, that I couldn't make out clearly the location of the soldier, and Bastet's increasing reality, more precisely defined. This thing appears to exist in contradiction to reality. It was an absence in and of itself, a human-shaped hole in the planet, and my eyesight swam after I stared at it for too long. And a stab in my stomach, the joyful whistle that had followed me throughout the night like smoke from a fire without a source coming out of it, persistently mistaken. They formed a semicircle in front of my seat, between me and the door, blocking any chance of fleeing. They didn't say anything, and they didn't move. They did nothing but wait, and in that wait I came to grasp the reality at last. I had been too conceited to notice. They weren't demons, and they weren't spirits either. They were precisely what the regulations had suggested from the start. Guardians, custodians, something far older and stranger than I could have imagined. There was no ghost in the museum. The museum was either a sanctuary or a jail, and these organizations were responsible for its care. The regulations were not superstitions or protective rights. They constituted the terms of a contract that enabled the living to travel through this location as long as they honored the limits. They were safe, and I had violated that agreement numerous times. Intentionally and haughtily, I had retrieved what wasn't mine. I had peeked at things that were not intended for the public view. I responded in a way that I should not have. Every breach was a trial, and my arrogance caused me to fail everyone. My skepticism, my unwillingness to believe those weren't barriers that had to be overcome, they have been my downfall. Simply, as Martin probably recognized too late, as whoever would follow me would ultimately discover. The soldier approached and extended its hand. With a dreadful formality, rather than a menace, as if an usher were directing a visitor to their seat, in its other hand, the key shone. My face was constantly in front of those wicked rock eyes. The whistling thing throbbed with something. Perhaps that was gratification, or a feeling I couldn't put my finger on, or hunger I felt like yelling or running away. I had the urge to do something, anything. However, be prepared for what was about to occur. But my body was no longer responding. All I could do was wait and see as the soldier got closer, as those dark, knowledgeable eyes enter mine, as the hand extended towards me and touched my forehead with ice, like fingers and the weight of centuries of iron after that. All went dark. I also felt myself. Entering the museum's collection 3 weeks later, I went to the Hall of History and Curiosities. On a gloomy Thursday afternoon, which brought all others to mind my upsetting task, ever since I joined the department, David Martinez was my name. And I've served as a government official, a paranormal researcher for 18 months. Long enough to realize the position was 99% administrative work. The situation was simple, with just 1% real craziness. This museum has one more missing person. Identical to the previous disappearance, veteran agent Alex Carver had gone missing during an overnight inventory job 3 weeks before. There were no indications of a break-in, no fight. No evidence from the security cameras. The local police had deemed it a voluntary disappearance, but protocol dictated a follow-up investigation at 6 o'clock in the afternoon. I ran into Mr. Albright in the parking lot. He seemed very old. He gripped a cane with his shaking hands as he bent over it, his eyes darting about as if he were anticipating anything to come out of it. The overgrown lot. At any time you are the new investigator. He could hardly be heard. I said, Agent Martinez. He recoiled when I extended my hand. I will be doing the overnight evaluation and submitting a report to my supervisors overnight. He uttered it as if it were a curse. Yes. They constantly dispatch someone overnight. He pulled out a little item from his cardigan pocket after rummaging around. The type of spiral notebook you would get at a gas station. Because his hands were trembling so much, I was afraid he would drop it. The regulations, you must follow their instructions to the letter. I grabbed the notebook without making any exceptions. With what I hoped was a reassuring smile. I'll remember them, Mr. Albright. No, he seized my arm with unexpected force. You'll adhere to their instructions to the letter. Carver, the final investigator, he believed he was superior. He believed the rules to be rubbish. Everything is bright. Tears of apparent sadness filled his eyes, or remorse. Do not repeat his errors. I pulled my arm out carefully. Sir, I work as a professional. I'll handle this well. As I approached the museum's entrance, I took a look at the notepad. 6 rules written in exceptionally legible handwriting, excessively meticulous and cautious. Whoever had copied them, for example, performed the task with extreme care. The ink appeared new. When the sun went down, I performed my initial walk-around. The museum met all of my expectations. Dusty old, packed with taxidermied animals and forgotten items. I took notes and pictures of everything. Systematically listing each display technique, I was drawn to the Civil War exhibit. 5 mannequins wearing attire from the era, placed in striking stances, however. One of them was a private union. It appeared as if standing at attention, was distinct from the others. The artistry was amazingly realistic. The face was frozen, in a manner that made me uneasy, in a manner that was difficult for me to express, perhaps terror, or the realization of something awful. The detail was amazing. The skin's pores were visible. The texture of terror in the widened eyes in the left hand of the dummy. It was grasping an ancient iron key. However, it was the right hand that caused me to pause. The fingers were curled as though they were grasping something. But the hand was still empty. There was something about the location, how the thumb and forefinger were positioned, which hinted at the existence of a ghost. Perhaps a pen. I established a union for the Civil War exhibition. The exceptional artistry of a private mannequin is displayed. Suggest an authenticity check. Perhaps I continued my rounds in the most recent edition. In the Egyptian display, there was a stone sculpture of a bastard that I obediently turned to face the wall after reading the first rule. I took the time to read. It felt silly, however. Bright's terror had been real and amusing. The elderly man's superstition appeared to be rather innocuous. When I arrived at the security office, the office was just as it was when night had completely fallen. In accordance with Carver's first observations, chair for a desk, a bank of monitors, and an antique rotary phone that seemed like it should be in a museum by itself, I sat down in the chair and started reading Carver's file. Going over his paperwork, thoroughly professional, precisely what I would anticipate from a seasoned investigator. However, there were no entries. Following the first several hours of his workday, The study just came to an end. The notebook containing the regulations was placed next to the phone, and now I read them more attentively. Rule 1. If you hear whistling coming from the Old Town Square diorama until it stops, hold your breath. It keeps track of your breathing. I turned my head and said this was precisely what I meant. The sort of superstition nonsense that was a waste of everyone's time, however, upon closer examination of the writing, I noticed that. I felt a nagging sensation that the ink was new. However, the notebook cover was worn out. The edges were worn out. How many times had these regulations been changed? And whose handwriting was this? I took out Carver's file and compared the writing examples. The first notes he submitted his signature on the duty log. I then went back over the regulations. The handwriting was a match, and my blood ran cold. Nearly, if not exactly, the regulations had been reduplicated. Written in Alex Carver's hand following his disappearance at precisely 9:47 p.m. The whistling started, and I could hear it.